So somebody called up David Pakman's show and had a question on the issue of foreign policy. Now, I'm going to play this for you because I was mentioned, and not by Pakman, but by the caller. And I'll play out Pakman's response as well, but I want to go ahead and respond here too, so that people get a more robust sense of what my interpretation of a left-wing foreign policy is.
Military intervention, like the liberals are against that, conservatives are for that. So it's kind of like, isn't it more rational to see case by case, like say the positive ones, like Afghanistan or like Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then you have the negative ones like Iraq, which had so catastrophic consequences.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, so here's the thing. There's a few different issues there. Number one, we can identify positive changes caused by American military action in Afghanistan, but it's also been disastrous in many ways. So let's not debate here the specific interventions, because I think that there's a broader point that you're making, which is the more important one, which is, of course, we should be considering all of these cases on a case-by-case basis. Any sort of blanket statement that the military should simply not, I mean, the military exists in part because sometimes countries decide they need to get involved in what's going on in other countries, right? So any blanket statement that the military should just never do anything in other countries, that doesn't make any sense to me. I think that there are a bunch of different ways in which we need to evaluate military engagements. One is the legal aspect, because there have been a lot of problematic military interventions over the last 20 years, which in different ways have arguably violated either U.S. policy when it comes to separation of powers and or international law. That should be a factor. The financial incentives that may be clouding our perception of where the United States should get involved need to be discussed when we talk about wars for oil, for example. Coalition involvement. The idea of the United States as the unilateral world's policeman is something that I'm against. The United States being part of consortiums or alliances where we might say, hey, you know what? Russia's aggression in Ukraine, a country that is much smaller than Russia, much poorer than Russia, under-resourced, we need to get involved there because they are the recipients of aggression from Russia. That's a very different thing than saying, hey, you know what? We're going to invade X country and be greeted as liberators, whatever, right? So, yeah, I mean, you're making a great point, which unfortunately it should be obvious, but it's not to many people, which is we need to be evaluating every engagement of the military on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, because I see here on the left, a lot of like pundits, when you talked about the military intervention, they just go, oh, we should not have gone there, we shouldn't have gone there. They're like totally against that.
Okay, but they may be right about that. That's different. That's different. Background,
sure,
but saying that we shouldn't have gone to a certain place, you first called and said, doesn't it make more sense to evaluate each instance case by case? And the answer is yes. Saying that it was a mistake to have done one or another military intervention, that's completely fine to do. I think that that's exactly what we should be doing, analyzing what decisions have been made.
Yeah. Because I've been following you and Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk and Cenk Uygur. Okay. And I saw Cenk Uygur saying, I think he says he's mildly interventionist. I think something along the lines of that. But when I see like something like Kyle, and he's totally against that. Like it's kind of like sometimes it feels that it's people on the left are like blindly rejecting the military intervention, where as someone who had like seen the obvious changes made by U.S. intervention in a country of my own, I think we should have more we should see the perspective on this issue.
We should, unfortunately, the U.S.'s record on intervention has not been particularly stellar over the last 100 years.
Okay, so let's dive into this. What should the left-wing approach on foreign policy be? This is an important conversation to have because on so many other issues, we now have a set of beliefs where we can really we could talk about them and we can summarize them in brief and clear ways where everybody gets it. And I think we're able to win a lot of support that way. I think that when we talk about Medicare for all and we talk about free college and we talk about a living wage, These are things that have broad appeal, and we can go into the details of them a little bit, and it's relatively easy to convince people because the polls show people already kind of overwhelmingly agree with us. But on foreign policy, it's a little bit vague because oftentimes we discuss it in terms of what we're against more than what we're for, and that's harder, I think, to convince people when it's just a matter of talking about what you're against. Like, what are we actually for is a good question. So first of all, let's go through the list here, and this, in order to have this conversation, we do have to talk about what we're also against, but I'll get to what we're for as well. So the first point, which might be the most important point, is we should argue international law is not debatable, okay? So we're not above international law. We're a nation among nations, not a nation above nations. And honestly, even though this seems like a duh position, the way the United States acts on the world stage is the polar opposite of what I just said. We act as if we're 100% above the law. So to get back to a place where we acknowledge international law, we respect international law, and we abide by international law, that's step one. And I think that makes perfect sense. And you honestly can run as, hey, I'm a law and order candidate. What law and order do I believe in? Well, when it comes to our foreign policy, I believe in international law, and we need to follow international law like anybody else because we care about law and order. That's the hallmark of a civilized, enlightened society. So that's point number one. Now, again, as of right now, people just kind of assume, like, well, obviously you're the world police, right? But there's a lot of baggage that comes along with that claim. If you're the world police, the way we act as the world police, it's not actually because we care about human rights. If we cared about human rights, we would be doing everything in our power to stop the destruction and genocide of Yemen, which is happening right now, but we're actively facilitating and helping the genocide continue. So that should tell you we're not actually the world police. And when we do what we do around the world in terms of our interventions and our approach to various nations is we care more about geopolitical power. We care more about having our hand on natural resources. We care more about our corporate hegemony more than we care about any commitments to human rights. We just don't have those commitments like they pretend we do. The second point is, when can you do a unilateral attack? This is a very fair question because people will often say, oh, Kyle's against all intervention. That's actually not true. I'm for a unilateral attack for defense of the nation. So if I was president, would we have gotten involved in World War II? You bet your ass we would have gotten involved in World War II. Hitler was a madman. He was taking over everywhere, and he literally declared war on the United States. What am I going to do? I'm going to go, no, I'm a committed non-interventionist. Well, see, there is a position called pacifism, which says, even if you attack me, I'm not going to do dick. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist. I believe in violence, but I believe in violence only in cases of self-defense. So that's when you do unilateral violence. Now, then this leads to the next question, which again is a perfectly reasonable question, where people say, okay, but what if there's a genocide going on somewhere? What are you going to do about that? Just sit back and let the genocide happen? To which I respond, no. In the case of a clear-cut genocide, and let me be clear, I'm not talking about a civil war. If it's a civil war, I'm not getting involved. I'm not. I'm just not. Two sides, roughly equal in force. You know, what? I'm going to get in the middle of a fucking civil war? Fuck no. If it's a civil war, it's a different thing, and I'm not getting involved at all. If we're talking about a genocide, I'm okay with a multilateral approach. So in other words, the U.S. can get together with the UN, and you have the international community gets together, and wherever possible, we act defensively to prevent a genocide, and also wherever possible, the international community relies on diplomacy. But if we can't rely on diplomacy, then yes, you can use force, but with the international community to prevent some sort of a genocide. So if you came to me with a plan to stop the genocide of the Rohingyas, it would depend on the details of the plan, but I would probably say yes, if we're doing it with the international community and it's not unilateral. If you come at me with the plan to prevent more of the genocide in Yemen, I would hear you out and probably approve it if it makes sense. Because again, I'm in favor of a multilateral approach, an approach with the international community. You can use force to prevent an actual genocide. Okay? And again, so that's the one thing people strawman me with that has never been true. Where they say, oh, yeah, well, if there's a genocide, he would just sit back and let it happen. It's not true. The one rule, though, is you have to do it with the international community. You can't do it unilaterally, because why? And that's an important distinction, and it's an important caveat. Why can't we do it unilaterally? Because then you're buying into the premise of we should be the world police, and you're also buying into the premise of, well, obviously, you can trust them to be the world police. And no, you can't trust the U.S. to be world police in the same way you can't trust any empire in human history, any superpower to be the world police, because they have their own motivations and their own biases. And that brings us right back to the point of we care more about geopolitical power and natural resources and corporate hegemony than anything else. So it's a human nature thing. You can't have this one nation be above the other nations, because that is going to lead to exploitation. So that point needs to be made. And then finally, here's my last point on the hallmark of a left-wing foreign policy. So that's my general take. You get it. The three-pronged approach. Number one, international law isn't debatable. We're not above it, even though that's how we act right now. We have to go back to a place where international law is not debatable. Number two, you can do a unilateral attack if it's in defense of the nation. Okay, that's when you use unilateral force. Number three, you can do a multilateral approach, and you could use violence in a multilateral way with the international community if it's to stop a genocide, okay? But only then. And then finally, and this is the part that people don't realize, it would probably have the biggest impact. We need to immediately stop selling weapons to human rights violators, whether they're nations who are our allies or whether they're groups that are questionable in the first place. So no more selling weapons to so-called moderate rebels in Syria. No more selling weapons to Israel as they continue to do illegal occupation and apartheid. No more selling weapons to Saudi Arabia as they continue to do a genocide in Yemen. If we had a hard and fast rule that we actually applied, no selling weapons to human rights violators, you would immediately see a gigantic cut in worldwide terrorism. You would immediately see a gigantic cut in unnecessary deaths around the world. And that is such an important point, and nobody talks about it. And Noam Chomsky has this great quote. There's an easy way to stop terrorism. Stop participating in it. So for us to immediately stop doing offensive invasions of countries that didn't attack us, for us to immediately stop bombing countries that didn't attack us, that's us cutting back on our own terrorism when we kill innocent civilians, okay? But then also, stop arming rogue regimes, terrorist nations, human rights violators. That's how you make the world a better place. So that, to me, this is the clearest left-wing foreign policy that makes sense. It's not, wishful thinking, pie-in-the-sky pacifism that acts like, there's no time when violence is okay. It's not that. But it's also not being disingenuous and skirting around the edges and acting like, no, we can still sort of be above other nations and violate international law. No. We need a clear, moral, ethical foreign policy that makes sense and is logical, and I think that's what I just laid out.